Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the Last Lifeline asset recreation process. If you haven't watched part 1 already, then please do, because it's going to provide a bit of context for what this is, alongside some more asset creations. I'm not going to prolong this introduction, so let's begin where we left off in the contestant order. Next up, we have the dollar bill, whose personality seems to be worth just as much as their actual values, not that much at all. And before I end up getting complaints such as, boo, background character, let me say something about Dollar. They act as if they're a background character on purpose. I can't exactly reveal how that will affect interactions within the show itself, but just keep that in mind for now. Their old design also looked like they were a background character, and considering how I was going around and updating all of the assets, I would need to fix that. Dollar needed to look more like a dollar bill. Some indigo influence came into play with the color schemes and texture here. And a reminder from part 1, the drawings I put down in this corner here are the versions of these characters she drew. And it also inspired me to change his design a bit more, trying to make him feel less like Monopoly money and more realistic, primarily by adding those borders on the rims and more simplified features of the American dollar. Also, just as a note, the little bits of shading you see primarily in the center of the asset are meant to represent a wrinkled paper effect, because tell me, when was the last time you saw a perfectly flat dollar bill? Furthermore, this might be one of the few assets that actually made a little bit more dull in color scheme. My asset style isn't just about a whole lot of vibrancy like you may have thought from some of these assets. Realism comes into play too. And this is actually still not dull enough for an actual dollar bill. I leave this remake like this, however, just so we all know I'm not trying to go 100% on realism. This is still an animated cartoon, guys. Now, we have the G's. There's quite a number of characters in the cast whose names actually start with the letter G, or more specifically, 5 if you include Gin's Cap. As for the contestants, the first of the G's I'll be showcasing is this one, Galiano Garlic. I don't actually know where the hell the Galiano part came from, but I assume it had to do with some garlic species biology bullcrap that I don't know much about. Regardless, just like Clay Pigeon, Galiano wasn't in the original cast. They got on as a debuter around episode 9 of Cal's Lifeline, but ended up placing dead last in the finale. I would say that's gotta hurt, but they excused. So what can I say? Technically, there was nothing wrong with the old design, but like it did look like garlic definitely, but it could have done a lot better with the shading, since in the old asset, the garlicky grooves were representative of just lines and not actual shading. Some indigo influence convinced me to actually shade in the grooves of the character. I overall ended up making them less pink in color as well. Yeah, I will say, there wasn't a whole lot that changed with this asset other than that. Even if it does look miles better than before in my opinion, a garlic bulb isn't exactly a complicated object compared to some of the others we have in the cast. Now, here's something funny to note. This cast actually has 2 characters of the same object type, being the tokens. That little tidbit might form a base for some of the future interactions that some characters will have with each other. But for now, here's one of the 2 tokens, Gamer. And for the record, the creation of this asset took me so much longer than I am mentally okay with. Despite seeming like a simpler character to recreate, their asset remake was one of the longest out of the entire cast thus far. You'll see what I mean later. For now, time to describe the details themselves. Gamer Token's engravement was originally a controller's D-pad, but a little tidbit I'll mention for that as well, this old version of the asset wasn't even the oldest version of the asset. The very oldest version of this asset has the D-pad replaced with the common BFDI token signature of 2 characters, GT. And that was pretty freaking boring. And thus when I was contemplating revamping the assets for the first time back in summer of 2023, even though I never actually went through the revamped then, I did replace the text with the D-pad. But in the remake, the D-pad is replaced with an actual game controller, similar to the version of the asset that Indigo had made. The very specific way that I layered part of this asset is so different perspectives of this character could be made much more easily, by the way. Unfortunately, the front-facing asset isn't exactly a good example of that. Also, fun fact, remaking these headphones took me a lot longer than I expected as well. I consistently struggled getting the correct shape here, and a surprising amount of my time was spent on the headphones as a result. So yes, remaking the gamer token asset was somehow deceptively challenging. Also, I fixed these issues off camera, but I left the borders of the headphones too thin, and there's a microphone attached to the headphones that I forgot to add on here. Just as a note for the asset comparison, because Chroma here's a dumbass. Tell me, do you believe in astrology? Here's the thing, I personally don't, but there is a character based on the concept. More specifically, Gemini. This zodiac sign is supposed to reflect upon some playful and intellectually curious personality. And although the latter is true, they are a bit of a pessimist. This asset remake wasn't that complicated, so here's a brief story time I guess. When Gemini was first introduced into the cast, the line, which is the name I've used to refer to the Last Lifeline staff team, had struggled to properly reflect him as a character. There was very little known about him at the time, since in Cal's Lifeline their creator had quit on episode 1. Eventually we did get an actual personality sorted out for him, but that was only because of a specific series of events. Remember in part 1 when I was discussing about Clay Pigeon, and I said that there was a character removed from the cast which allowed him to become a cast member from the beginning? Well, although it would be highly controversial to talk about the creator of this removed character, I will mention them briefly. This is chromiumbii oxide peroxide. In May 2023, they were removed from the cast after some controversies occurred. I will not go any further than that. One of the most bitter things about removing this character was the fact that they were one of the most developed in Cal's Lifeline, and many staff members in the line worried that removing him would cause a bunch of plot holes. I looked at Gemini, who was still lacking a personality, and thought about a way to compromise here. Although Chromium as a character will be physically removed, many of his character traits will be moved on to Gemini. Sorry for the long ramble there, but back to the asset. Very little had changed except for some color changes, and some shine was added to the asset, inspired by Indigo, once again. And that's it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, everyone. Is the glass half full, or is it half empty? Well, anyone who said the glass is half full is in the wrong here, sadly. Because the glass herself told me that it was half empty. This is a glass of water, and she can be summarized as being a nervous wreck who happens to be so unlucky it's not even funny anymore. Even if she could bet both sides of a coin in a coin toss, in that case, the coin would land on its side. Now, I don't believe in divine intervention, but if you're in Water's shoes, or non-existent shoes because she's an object, I think you definitely would, considering the crap she has to deal with. And now for the asset itself, one of the main changes here was that I rounded the bottom of the glass. This was both inspired by Indigo and inspired by the shading of some glasses in real life. Although most cups aren't curved on the bottom like this unless they're made of plastic, sometimes the light can make it seem like so, and this is one of the times where I'll use a little bit of cartoonish over realism. There was also some shading adjustments, including adding some gradation to the glass itself. I didn't add it to the water, however, that would be carried over by the transparency of the glass. Now, it's important to note that there is no dark shading in this asset. Indigo once told me in a voice chat that it was not a good idea to add dark shading to a glass object because of the fact that glass is see-through and thus there is no dark side, which is why all dark shading from the original asset had been completely removed in the remake. We just need to get rid of the dark spots in Water's head now. Sometimes I feel like I'd lose my head if it weren't attached to my body. But for this next character, Highlighter, that isn't even a metaphor anymore. Also, if you mention Rainbow Riot, I'll give you a detachable head, alright? Regardless, their head can detach from the rest of their body, which means I have to make a separate asset for his headpiece. There are a couple major changes I made with this asset, which you'll see soon, but for now I'll mention how I try to improve the actual shading of the object. Both influenced by Indigo and some real life highlighters, I tried to make the asset look more neon in color, even if the overall color was ironically less neon green overall. Perhaps it feels more vibrant regardless because of the shine I added to their body. Also, the highlighter sticker was simplified a bit since there's no longer text on the front of their body that screams "Highlighter" on it. Well, you don't need to state the obvious, said Indigo indirectly, though it was humorous trying to adjust the colors of the sticker properly. But the actual biggest change I made came with the inside of the highlighter. The black top that surrounded the highlighter tip drowned out and can now be visible even when the cap is on. This was inspired by the design of a couple specific highlighter brands, and although I do feel like it may be a controversial choice, it may help this design stand out more in a potential crowd of highlighter characters. Here's the last asset for part 2, and guess what, I managed to steal this character from Inanimate Insanity. Just kidding, I didn't actually steal anyone, but rather I said this because the next character likes to look on the bright side of things in a more literal way, and they share an object type with the II character. Yes, it's Lightbulb, and ironically this Lightbulb isn't even turned on at all. I mean, they can turn themselves on, but they blind themselves temporarily doing so. That's not the point, moving on. One of the main differences come in the form of the bulb itself. It is now a much more consistent curve, and unlike the old asset, it doesn't chop the circle with a straight line at the bottom of the glass bulb. God, that feels like such a weird analogy to make when it comes to designs of objects. And if you remember what Indigo said about lighting in the glass of water section, you'll remember that glass has no dark spots. But considering the way that I've seen her constantly draw glass objects, I figured the opposite side of where the light hits is also bright as well. The little spirals around the metal base of the bulb are slightly different, not drastically, but they do feel slightly more realistic when they're not constrained to the line art of the rest of the asset, in my opinion. Also, the spirals no longer drive down to the circular bottom because that just doesn't look good in my opinion. Finally, the little metal wires on the interior of the bulb got changed as well. They might look weird, but it is A, in fact, realistic, and B, barely noticeable in an actual character pose. Although they barely got any runtime in Cal's Lifeline, I honestly think this little guy is someone I'm rather excited to work with.